Welcome to the J-Spot Deep Dive, the place where we stimulate the most sensitive parts of your brain deeper than usual.
Thanks for having me back. This is quite a topic we've got today.
It really is. I mean, I want you, the listener, to kind of hold a specific question in the back of your mind as we go through today's deep dive.
Right, the big defining question.
Exactly. It's arguably the defining question of this entire decade. Are the tectonic forces that are reshaping our politics today, are they a brand new phenomenon born from social media and modern grievances, or
are we actually experiencing something older?
Yeah, the distinct, recognizable echoes of the 1930s just, playing out in the digital age?
It's a heavy question.
It's incredibly heavy. And today is Saturday, March 28, 2026, and we are embarking on a really profound, deeply serious mission for this session.
We're looking at the blueprint.
Right. We are analyzing the historical blueprint of authoritarianism. The goal here is to help you recognize the structural historical patterns of democratic decay before they actually become our modern consequences.
It's an ambitious mission, for sure. But the source material we are unpacking today provides just an incredibly detailed roadmap for doing exactly that.
So the primary source we're working from is this massive, heavily researched analytical report. It's titled The Palingenetic Continuum, a comparative analysis of interwar authoritarianism and modern national populism.
Quite a mouthful of a title.
Right. And before we get into the mechanics of what that title actually means, I need to establish some ground rules for you today, our listener.
Yeah, that's crucial.
Because this report analyzes some heavily charged political content. I mean, the sociologists and historians who authored this text are drawing structural and linguistic comparisons between historical regimes.
Like Weimar Germany, fascist Italy.
Exactly. And they are comparing those to current global governments, explicitly including the current U.S. administration.
And the comparisons in the text, they're stark. They look at rhetoric, executive actions, the erosion of institutional norms, just across the board.
Which means, I must emphasize this to you up front, neither of us here are taking political sides.
Absolutely not.
We are not endorsing any political viewpoints, and we are definitely not telling you what to believe. We are acting purely as academic guides.
Right. Impartial observers.
We will impartially unpack the comparative linguistics and the political sociology exactly as it is documented in our source material. Nothing more, nothing less.
Because the value of this deep dive isn't in, scoring partisan points. The value is in stepping back and looking at the architecture of how democracies unravel objectively.
Let's actually talk about that architecture. Because, when we look at a blueprint for a physical building, there is this comforting sense of permanence.
Sure, you see the walls, the foundation.
Right. You see the load-bearing walls and you trust the physics of it. But when you look at the blueprint of a democratic society, the institutions, the norms, the checks and balances...
It's totally different.
Yeah, you realize those load-bearing walls are just made of shared belief.
They are entirely ephemeral. The moment a critical mass of the population stops believing in the legitimacy of the structure, the concrete essentially turns to sand.
It's terrifying when you phrase it like that.
But it's true. The guardrails only exist if everyone, or at least the vast majority, agrees to be bound by them.
Okay, let's unpack this core concept from the report's title, the palingenetic continuum.
Right, the big academic term.
The text relies heavily on the work of scholar Roger Griffin, who defines the mythic core of fascism as palingenetic ultranationalism.
Yeah.
Now, I understand ultranationalism, but palingenesis is not exactly a word you hear on the nightly news.
No, it's definitely not. So it comes from Greek, palin meaning again, and genesis meaning birth. So palingenesis is a national rebirth.
Okay, national rebirth.
But it's not just a generic, promise of improvement like vote for me and I'll fix the roads. It is a highly specific narrative arc.
How so?
The myth asserts that the nation has suffered a period of profound decadence, humiliation, and moral decay.
Usually brought about by someone specific, right?
Exactly. Usually internal traitors or foreign corruption. And the core idea is that the nation can only be saved by a radical cleansing rebirth.
So it's like promising a society, a phoenix rising from the ashes, but weaponizing that hope against a perceived enemy.
That visual captures the danger perfectly. The palingenetic myth relies on this sense of existential dread.
Like everything is about to end.
Right. It convinces the population that they aren't just facing policy disagreements. They're facing the total annihilation of their culture.
And fear is a massive motivator.
The biggest. And when you believe your culture is about to be extinguished, you become willing to accept extreme, extra-legal measures to ensure that rebirth.
But wait, I'm trying to square this with historical monarchies and dictatorships. Isn't that just traditional authoritarianism?
Actually, no, and that's a really key point.
Because kings and military juntas have been promising to restore order and squash their enemies for centuries, right? How is this mythic core different from a standard dictator saying, I'm in charge now, everyone quiet down?
What's fascinating here is the source material makes a brilliant distinction between conserving and revolutionizing.
Okay, break that down.
So traditional authoritarianism, say a 19th century monarchy or a Cold War military, junta operates on demobilization. They want to conserve the status quo.
They just want people to be quiet.
Exactly. The message to the public is stay home, pay your taxes, let the elites handle the politics. They want apathy.
They don't want you in the streets, they want you invisible.
Exactly. The opposite is true for movements on the palingenetic continuum. Fascism and its modern populist offshoots have a revolutionary intent.
So they actually want the chaos.
They don't want apathy. They demand total mobilization. They want massive rallies. They seek to forge a quote-unquote new man through constant agitation.
Wow, so it's active, not passive.
Right. It is a dynamic, hyperactive political state that relies on mass enthusiasm and, historically, the positive valuation of violence as a necessary cleansing tool.
That is deeply unsettling. And the researchers trace this underlying psychological architecture straight into the modern era.
You do.
The report looks at the historical promise, the Third Reich in Germany, or Mussolini's new Roman Empire, which were literal promises of a glorious new epoch, erasing recent humiliations.
And then they compare the structural appeal of those myths to modern political slogans.
And the linguistic parallels are undeniably present in the text. I mean, slogans like Make America Great Again or the Brexit campaign's Take Back Control operate on the exact same rhetorical frequency.
They really do.
And to be clear to you, the listener, the researchers are not saying a modern voter in Ohio or Yorkshire has the same geopolitical goals as a 1930s European fascist.
No, not at all.
They are analyzing the structure of the appeal. It is the premise that greatness or control has been fundamentally stolen by a period of intentional decline and must be aggressively, urgently reclaimed.
Right, because a rebirth requires a prior death, and it requires someone to blame for that death.
And historically, who was that?
Well, in the interwar period, the palingenetic narrative relentlessly attacked international finance or shadowy plutocrats, which was often coded or just explicit anti-Semitism, claiming these forces were sapping the nation's vitality from within.
Which brings us to the modern equivalent identified in the text. The rhetoric against the deep state, or globalists, or the corrupt elites.
The structure of the grievance is identical.
Yeah, it frames the struggle not against a competing political party with different tax policies, but against a shadowy, entrenched cabal that is subverting the true will of the people.
And if you have a shadowy, entrenched cabal that controls the traditional levers of power, well, you cannot rely on traditional institutions to defeat them.
Because the institutions are part of the cabal.
Exactly. So you need a singular savior. Historically, this manifests as the Führerprinzip, or the leader principle.
The leader principle.
Yeah, where the leader ceases to be a mere politician and becomes the mystical embodiment of the nation itself.
So the leader's word supersedes the law, because the leader is the nation. The modern parallel the text draws is the rise of movements demanding absolute loyalty to a single person over a party platform, or even over established constitutional frameworks.
Which we see happening.
Yeah, the researchers point out how modern politicians increasingly frame themselves as the sole saviors of a declining culture, rather than, public servants applying for a temporary administrative role.
It fundamentally alters the social contract.
Yeah.
I mean, in a pluralistic democracy, a leader is supposed to represent all citizens, including those who didn't vote for them.
Right, that's the whole point of a republic.
But in a movement driven by palingenetic ultranationalism, the leader only represents the quote-unquote true nation. Everyone else is an obstacle to the rebirth.
But ideologies, even incredibly potent ones, they don't just catch fire in a vacuum.
No.
I mean, you can have a charismatic fudger standing on a soapbox shouting about national rebirth and shadowy elites.
Sure, people shout on corners all the time.
Right. But for millions of people to actually abandon their centrist traditions and follow that figure, something has to be deeply, fundamentally broken in their daily reality.
The soil has to be conditioned to accept the seed. And the source text spends a massive amount of time analyzing the economic and institutional environment that breeds this kind of authoritarian appeal.
And they focus heavily on Weimar Germany for this.
Yeah, they use the collapse of the Weimar Republic as the primary historical benchmark for how democracies die legally.
I think when people picture the fall of Germany, they immediately fast forward to the 1930s and the establishment of the dictatorship.
They skip right over the crucial part.
Exactly. But the 1920s in Weimar Germany is really the critical period we need to understand, isn't it? What were the specific stressors that rewired the psychology of the German voter?
The trauma was just multi-layered. You start with the catastrophic defeat in World War I, followed immediately by the Treaty of Versailles.
Which was devastating financially.
It imposed crushing financial reparations and a profound sense of national humiliation. But the true psychological rupture, the thing that broke the middle class, was the hyperinflation crisis of 1923.
The images of people with wheelbarrows of cash?
Exactly. And then the subsequent devastation of the Great Depression in 1929.
So the hyperinflation completely wiped out the savings and the security of the middle class.
Completely.
And the researchers emphasize a critical sociological point here. When you destroy middle-class security, you invariably destroy their faith in moderate centrist governance.
The center simply hollows out. When people are desperate, when the traditional systems have so spectacularly failed to protect their livelihoods, they stop listening to politicians offering incremental policy tweaks.
A tiny tax cut doesn't matter when you can't buy bread.
Right. They turn to extremists on both the far left and the far right who promise radical, immediate solutions to unbearable pain.
Obviously, the United States in the 2020s has not lost a devastating world war, and we are not taking wheelbarrows full of cash to buy bread. But the source text draws a very deliberate structural parallel to modern economic traumas.
They look at the 2008 global financial crisis.
Right, and the incredibly uneven recovery that followed, the economic whiplash of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the reality of runaway generational wealth inequality.
The underlying mechanism of delegitimation is incredibly similar. I mean, consider the psychological impact of 2008.
It was huge.
A massive economic shock occurs. The public perceives, largely correctly I might add, that the financial institutions responsible for the crash were bailed out by the government, while average homeowners lost everything.
And that creates a profound, lingering resentment.
It plants the narrative that the democratic system isn't just incompetent, it is actively rigged.
The researchers used the term plutocracy government, by and for the wealthy, and they introduced a concept that I found fascinating called asymmetric polarization.
This is a really crucial structural observation.
Yeah, they argue that this runaway inequality has forced a fundamental shift in the political strategy of the right.
The analysis suggests that right-wing political parties, in many Western democracies, have a dilemma. Their core economic policies often heavily favor corporations and the super rich, which, is not a naturally popular platform for a majority of voters.
So to maintain an electoral base, they have to pivot.
Exactly.
So they use divisive identity appeals to build that base. They tap into the cultural anxieties of less affluent, often rural, white voters who feel marginalized by rapid social change and completely left behind by the modern globalized economy.
The economic anxiety creates the vulnerability, and the cultural identity-based rhetoric provides the target.
It directs the anger.
Right. And the text notes that structurally, this has caused the political right to move significantly further from the center than the political left over the last few decades. The polarization becomes asymmetric.
And this polarization isn't just something that makes Thanksgiving dinner uncomfortable. It fundamentally breaks down the machinery of government.
It grinds it to a halt.
Which brings us to a part of the text that genuinely gave me pause. We can talk about economic anxiety, but the U.S. has a constitution that is well over 200 years old. We have entrenched institutions. Weimar Germany was a brand new, fragile democracy.
It was an experiment.
So how do the actual legal guardrails of a mature democracy fall?
They fall through habituation to legal loopholes. Democracies rarely collapse because a dictator simply declares the Constitution void on day one.
That's a movie trope, not reality.
Right. They collapse because the Constitution contains emergency provisions that become normalized through overuse. In Weimar Germany, the fatal flaw was Article 48.
Okay, let's really drill down into Article 48, because the text positions this as the ultimate cautionary tale for modern executive power.
Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution allowed the president to rule by decree during times of national emergency.
Sounds reasonable in theory.
In theory. It was designed as a temporary safeguard, a way to bypass the slow legislature if there was a sudden armed uprising or an immediate crisis that required swift action.
But the legislature in Weimar was incredibly fractured. Proportional representation meant there were dozens of parties, and because of the massive polarization we just discussed, they couldn't form coalitions.
They couldn't agree on anything.
They couldn't pass basic, day-to-day legislation.
So Out of sheer administrative desperation, the president just started using Article 48 to govern normally.
Just bypassing the parliament entirely?
Entirely. He bypassed the parliament to pass budgets and standard laws. Over several years, the public became completely habituated to the idea that the executive branch simply dictates the laws without any legislative debate or compromise.
They got used to a dictatorship long before the totalitarian regime was formally established in 1933.
The muscle of democratic deliberation had simply atrophied.
And the researchers draw a direct procedural line from the abuse of Article 48 to the modern normalization of executive orders and national emergency declarations in the United States.
The parallel is alarming. Today, because Congress is frequently paralyzed by hyperpolarization and the filibuster, presidents of both parties increasingly bypass the legislative branch.
They govern via the pen,
issuing sweeping executive orders on immigration, student debt, environmental regulations, and trade.
And while those actions are legally tested within the American system, they go to court, the source is warning about the psychological habituation.
It's about what the public expects.
Right. We are training the public to view the president not as a co-equal branch of government executing the laws of Congress, but as an elected monarch who is expected to solve massive societal problems by unilateral decree.
And once the public expects unilateral action, the slow, messy process of parliamentary compromise looks like failure.
It looks weak.
Exactly. And when institutions are viewed as failures, it opens the door for narratives that delegitimize the entire system. The text refers to this as the big lie.
The historical benchmark here is the Dolchstoss legend, the stab-in-the-back myth from post-World War I Germany.
Right. The German military high command could not accept the reality of their battlefield defeat in 1918. So they manufactured a massive conspiracy theory.
To save their own pride?
Yeah. They claimed the German army was actually undefeated and victorious, but they had been sabotaged, stabbed in the back on the home front by unpatriotic forces.
Specifically targeting Jews, socialists, and the new democratic politicians who signed the peace treaty.
It wasn't just a lie about a battle. It was a narrative engineered to permanently delegitimize the founding of the Democratic Republic.
And the source text directly compares the function of that myth to the modern narratives regarding a quote-unquote stolen 2020 election in the United States.
The sociological function is identical. Both the stab-in-the-back myth and the stolen election claims are intentionally designed to destroy faith in the peaceful transfer of power.
They reframe the current government not as a political opponent you disagree with, but as an illegitimate occupying force that seized power through treason.
And if you genuinely believe your government is an illegitimate occupying force, your moral calculus changes entirely.
Oh, of course it does.
You're much more likely to support extra-constitutional, even violent means to overthrow it because you view it as self-defense.
So let's map this out for a second. The economic anxiety is the kindling. The gridlock and executive overreach habituate the public to unilateral power.
Right.
The stolen election narrative delegitimizes the current system. If an aspiring authoritarian has all of that in place, how do they direct that localized anger into systemic action?
This is where it gets really dark.
Yeah, reading the section on how language is weaponized was genuinely uncomfortable. The text talks about dehumanization, but it frames it not as an emotional outburst from a politician, but as a clinical, calculated biological prerequisite for violence.
It's a cognitive hack.
A cognitive hack.
Yeah, the human brain is evolutionarily wired for moral concern. When we interact with another human being, specific areas of our brain light up that recognize their capacity for pain, for fear, for complex inner lives.
We naturally feel empathy.
Exactly. To get a society to look the other way while constitutional rights are stripped from their neighbors, you have to short-circuit that empathy center.
Here's where it gets really interesting and horrifying. The source highlights this very specific linguistic pattern, the metaphor family of exclusion.
It's never just calling the opposition corrupt or unpatriotic.
No, it's a systematic choice to call them parasites, bacilli, vermin, or rats.
The use of those specific biological words is incredibly deliberate. It bypasses the parts of the brain that deal with complex social reasoning and triggers the insula.
The part of the brain responsible for visceral, physical disgust.
Exactly. You don't debate a parasite. You don't negotiate a treaty with a bacilla.
You exterminate it.
It frames the exclusion and the violence not as a harsh political choice, but as a basic biological necessity for public health.
It creates a racist anthropology.
It does. It merges the biological with the political, convincing the broader community that these individuals are infectious pathogens that must be isolated or destroyed for the safety of the collective body politic.
And what is so alarming about the source material we are reviewing is that it documents a massive global resurgence of this exact metaphor family in contemporary political speech.
It's happening everywhere.
I'm going to read directly from the report's modern examples here. The text points out that in the modern Philippines, the administration systematically labeled drug users as zombies to justify extrajudicial killings by police and vigilantes.
Because a zombie isn't human. It's a threat that can only be stopped with violence.
Exactly. In Hungary, the leadership has repeatedly labeled immigrants and refugees as a poison. In Poland, officials have referred to refugees as carriers of parasites and protozoa.
It's the exact same language.
And the text brings this analysis directly to the United States. It quotes Donald Trump describing undocumented immigrants as animals and stating that they are poisoning the blood of our country. The researchers also highlight the use of the word vermin to describe domestic political opponents.
And the researchers explicitly connect this language to the historical record. I mean, the phrase poisoning the blood is a documented direct echo of Adolf Hitler's claims in Mein Kampf regarding quote-unquote blood poisoning caused by the presence of marginalized groups.
It's almost verbatim.
The use of the term vermin mimics the exact rhetorical strategy of both Hitler and Mussolini, who used it to license their followers to engage in street violence against anyone seen as an obstacle to the national rebirth.
The source material forces us to confront this not as just talk, but as a specific, historically tested mechanism.
Right, it's a tool.
The analysis from the Harvard Political Review cited in the text calls this rhetoric a test case. I want to spend some time on this because it changes how you view every controversial soundbite. If we connect this to the bigger picture, how does a test case work in this sociological framework?
An aspiring autocrat understands that they cannot usually start by stripping rights away from the majority of citizens.
The public immune system would reject it.
Precisely. So they start by targeting a heavily marginalized outgroup, in many modern cases, undocumented immigrants or specific minorities. They use this disgust-triggering, dehumanizing language to probe the public's reaction.
They throw the word vermin out there and wait to see what the temperature is.
Exactly. If they call a group animals and the public cheers, or if the press simply dismisses it as a controversial gaffe, or if the political establishment just shrugs and ignores it, that is a green light.
It's permission.
It tests whether the public will permit fundamental human rights, like due process, to be stripped from a dehumanized group without widespread revolt.
Because if the public allows the Constitution to be suspended for the vermin or the animals, the precedent is established, the legal wall has been breached.
And history shows us conclusively that once the mechanism of state cruelty is normalized and the legal protections are pierced for the outgroup, it is only a matter of time before those exact same violations are extended.
They creep inward.
They move from undocumented immigrants to legal immigrants to political opponents to the press and eventually to the general public. It is a slow, methodical dismantling of the republic's immune system.
It is an incredibly heavy realization. And as I was reading this section, I found myself thinking, okay, the 1930s were this unique, bizarre anomaly of evil. It was a glitch in the historical matrix driven by the aftermath of World War I.
That's a common misconception.
Right. But the text makes a compelling counterintuitive argument. To truly understand the architecture of today's national populism, we actually have to look much further back than the 1930s.
We have to look at the 19th century precursors of this anti-system rhetoric.
The source takes us back to the ancestors of modern populism, revealing that these palingenetic instincts, the desire for a strong man to bypass corrupt institutions, have deep, deep roots in both American and European history.
They do.
Let's start with the American example they use, which really surprised me. The text heavily analyzes Andrew Jackson.
A very foundational figure.
Now, Andrew Jackson is on the $20 bill. We learned about him in elementary school as the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. How does the text connect Jacksonian democracy to modern authoritarianism?
Jackson is a foundational figure in this context because he essentially invented the modern mythological persona of the political outsider.
Okay, the outsider.
Jacksonianism was built on a very raw, potent us versus them tribalism. He framed himself as the ultimate rough-hewn protector of the quote-unquote common people against a corrupt, entrenched aristocratic establishment in Washington.
He also targeted international financial interests, like his famous war against the Second Bank of the United States.
Yes, exactly. The scholarly analysis draws a direct line between Jackson's profound skepticism of elite institutions, his highly tribalistic political style, and modern movements like Donald Trump's America First.
So it's the exact same playbook.
In the Jacksonian tradition, the leader believes that they alone, personally, represent the legitimate will of the people.
And if you believe you are the sole avatar of the people's will, the traditional checks and balances just look like illegitimate roadblocks.
They're just getting in the way.
The text brings up the famous moment when Jackson simply defied the Supreme Court. The court ruled in favor of Native American land rights in Georgia, and Jackson essentially said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it.
It is a blatant, proud disregard for the separation of powers.
He just didn't care.
Jackson justified ignoring the judiciary by claiming a higher, purer mandate from the masses. The danger of the Jacksonian model is that it conflates the rule of law with the rule of the elite, convincing the public that destroying institutional checks is actually a victory for the common man.
The text then takes us across the Atlantic to 1880s France, introducing a figure I had never encountered before. General Georges Boulanger.
A fascinating historical figure.
And the parallels here to modern anti-establishment movements are almost uncanny.
Boulangism is one of the most important, yet least discussed, precursors to modern anti-system politics. In the late 19th century, France was operating under the Third Republic.
Which was a parliamentary system.
It was, but it was bogged down by constant economic instability, scandal, and a perception of deep political sleaze.
Enter General Boulanger, this incredibly charismatic military figure on horseback.
Very theatrical.
The text notes that he managed to do something that seems politically impossible today. He mobilized malcontents from both the far-left communists and the far-right nationalists simultaneously.
That's the crazy part.
How do you get those two extremes to agree on a political project?
By giving them a shared enemy that transcends their policy differences. The parliamentary system itself.
So they both just hate the system.
He rallied them against what he called the parliamentary republic. He argued that the endless debates, the compromises, the slow legalistic procedures of representative democracy were just a smokescreen designed to protect elite corruption and keep the people powerless.
He promoted a system of mass politics focused on direct democracy, referendums, and above all, firm, simple, unilateral authority.
Just let me fix it.
When I was reading this, the best analogy I could come up with is a corporate takeover. Boulanger basically claimed that the actual elected government, the parliament, the legal structures was useless, and only he truly represented the soul of the people.
That's a great way to think about it.
It's like a CEO taking over a struggling company and telling the employees to completely ignore human resources, ignore the legal department, and ignore the board of directors because only the CEO truly understands what the workers need, and all those other departments are just parasites stealing their wages.
That analogy captures the exact dynamic, and the source text formalizes this dynamic by introducing a critical sociological distinction: the rejection of the legal nation in favor of the real nation.
Let's pause on that phrase, the legal nation versus the real nation. What does that mean in practice?
In the mind of the populist authoritarian, the legal nation is the Constitution, the courts, the parliament, the press, the electoral college.
The actual machinery.
Right. It is the complex machinery of state. The real nation is a mystical, undefined concept of the quote-unquote true people. And crucially, the will of the real nation cannot be measured by something as mundane as a parliamentary vote. It can only be mystically interpreted by the populist leader.
So if the legal nation produces an outcome the leader doesn't like, say, an election loss or a court ruling, the leader can simply claim that the legal nation is suppressing the real nation, and therefore the law must be ignored.
Exactly. The researchers note that this inherent structural rejection of parliamentary discussion in favor of firm, unilateral authority is the defining hallmark of today's challenges to liberal democracy.
So Boulanger is the missing link.
The belief that representative democracy is structurally inadequate to represent the true people is the bridge from Boulanger to the 1930s and from the 1930s to today.
Which brings up a really critical transition in the historical timeline the researchers have built. We've looked at the 19th century roots. We've explored the catastrophic climax in the 1930s with fascism and the Holocaust. But the source asks a vital question. How did this authoritarian playbook survive after 1945?
It's a big pivot.
Because after World War II, the horrors of the concentration camps were exposed to the world. Fascism became universally reviled. It was politically and morally radioactive. So how did the palingenetic continuum adapt?
It adapted by putting on a democratic suit and tie.
It disguised itself.
The ideology had to mutate to survive the post-war global order. The text introduces the concept of populist post-fascism, and the historical prototype they use for this mutation is Juan Perón in Argentina.
Let's look closely at Peronism. How did Perón reformulate the legacy of fascism for a world that claimed it would never tolerate fascism again?
He essentially performed an inside job on democracy. Perón was highly influenced by European fascism. He spent time in Mussolini's Italy, but he was a pragmatist.
He knew it wouldn't work anymore.
Right. He realized that the overt, militaristic, violent elimination of enemies, the black shirts marching in the streets, the formal suspension of all rights, was no longer a viable path to power on the global stage.
So he changed the methodology. He renounced overt, extra-legal violence in favor of winning power through legitimate, democratic elections.
He ran a campaign, got the votes, and took office legally.
He played by the rules to get in.
Yes. He built a massive coalition of the working classes by convincing them that he alone understood their needs, and he targeted foreign capital and aristocratic elites as the enemies of the nation.
That sounds familiar.
But here is the insidious genius of the Peronist model. Once he won those legitimate elections, he used his democratic mandate to systematically hollow out democratic pluralism from within.
So Perón figures out how to use the tools of democracy to dismantle it from the inside out. How does he actually do that? The text introduces the term plebiscitary power. What does that mean for the rule of law?
Plebiscitary power is the weaponization of the majority against the Constitution.
Wait, weaponization of the majority?
The leader claims that because they won the election, under plebiscite, their mandate from the people is so pure and so absolute that it overrides all other institutional checks.
Basically, I won the election, therefore I am the law.
Essentially. Under this model, the leader doesn't formally abolish the Supreme Court. They just pack it with loyalists or ignore its rulings.
It's much subtler.
They don't formally ban the press. They just buy up the media conglomerates through oligarch allies or relentlessly harass journalists with libel laws until they self-censor.
They make it impossible to oppose them.
They slowly suffocate the independent structures of the state, all while claiming they're simply enacting the will of the people.
They maintain the aesthetic shell of a democracy. They still hold elections. They still have a parliament. But the internal machinery of opposition has been completely neutralized.
It's a zombie democracy.
And the source explicitly compares this Peronist model of quote-unquote authoritarian democracy to modern leaders we see right now globally. They point to Viktor Orban in Hungary, Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, and the systemic dismantling of institutions in Venezuela.
These are leaders who understand that in the 21st century, you don't need a violent military coup to kill a democracy. You just need to slowly rewrite the rule book from the inside until the opposition can never mathematically win again.
But reading this section on Perón's strategy of hollowing out institutions from the inside, I kept hitting a wall.
Why is that?
A leader can't just wave a wand and tell the public to ignore the Supreme Court or distrust the media unless the public already despises those institutions.
Oh, absolutely.
There has to be a pre-existing vacuum of trust for the autocrat to step into.
The leader cannot destroy an institution that the public deeply reveres and trusts. The ground must be softened first.
If we pull the lens back to America in the 2020s, that vacuum of trust isn't just theoretical anymore. The data presented in the source shows it is wide open, and frankly, the numbers are grim.
The Pew data is shocking.
We are looking at data from the Pew Research Center, and it shows a historic, precipitous decline in institutional trust.
It is a systemic collapse of faith. Public trust in the federal government is hovering near all-time lows. Confidence in Congress is exceptionally low, which, given the gridlock and hyperpolarization we discussed earlier with Article 48, is perhaps unsurprising.
People see it not working, so they don't trust it.
But it's not just the political branches.
That's the terrifying part. Non-political institutions that used to serve as the bedrock of a shared societal reality are also collapsing in the public's eyes.
Science, medicine, all of it.
The scientific community, the medical establishment, the mainstream press, all are seeing massive deficits in trust. The Supreme Court is specifically mentioned in the text as having suffered a severe decline in public confidence, largely due to recent rulings that a significant portion of the public perceives not as neutral jurisprudence, but as highly partisan activism.
When the Supreme Court is viewed merely as an extension of partisan politics, the concept of an impartial rule of law begins to evaporate in the minds of the citizens.
It just becomes another political weapon.
The presidency itself has also suffered a decline, transforming from a unifying national office into a hyper-partisan lightning rod.
But within all this dismal data, the text highlights one major glaring outlier. There is one institution that has maintained and in some metrics increased its level of public trust over the last few decades.
This raises an important question, an incredibly important and potentially dangerous question for a republic.
The military.
Yes, the military remains the absolute most trusted institution in the United States by a wide margin.
At first glance, you might think, well, that's good. We trust our armed forces. Why does the source text frame this as a paradox? Why is overwhelming trust in the military potentially problematic for a civilian democracy?
Because in a healthy republic, political problems, economic inequality, border security, healthcare are supposed to be solved by civilian political institutions. Congress, the courts, the voting booth.
That's the foundation of our system.
The military is designed for external defense, not domestic policy.
Right.
If the public completely loses faith in all civilian institutions, viewing them as hopelessly corrupt, paralyzed, and sleazy, and the only institution they respect is the hierarchical, disciplined military, history shows a very dark pattern.
The man on horseback.
A deeply polarized, exhausted public may eventually begin to favor military or authoritarian solutions to enforce domestic order. When politics is viewed as a chaotic mess, the man in uniform offering to clean up the streets and bypass the politicians starts to look deeply appealing.
We start looking for a General Boulanger.
Exactly. The trust deficit primes the population to accept the suspension of democratic norms in the name of efficiency and order.
And a massive driver of this trust deficit is the fact that we don't even agree on what the facts are anymore. I want to contrast our current moment with the 1930s because the mechanics of propaganda have entirely inverted.
The technology changed everything.
In the 30s, dictators like Hitler and Mussolini used the radio to force a single, top-down, unified propaganda narrative on the entire nation. They banned all other information. Today, it feels like the exact opposite is happening, yet it's producing the same destructive results.
The source explores this under the concept of digital authoritarianism. The 20th century model was about information scarcity and control. The 21st century model relies on information overload and the deliberate fracturing of reality.
It's overwhelming.
It is driven by what political scientists call the misperception problem and affective polarization.
Let's define affective polarization because the text leans on this heavily.
Traditional polarization means you disagree with the other party on policy, taxes, foreign intervention, etc. Affective polarization means your disagreement has mutated into visceral emotional hatred.
It becomes personal.
You don't just think the other side has bad ideas. You genuinely view them as fundamentally immoral, extreme, and an existential threat to the survival of the country.
And this isn't happening by accident. The text points directly to the digital information environment. Social media algorithms are not designed to inform us. They're designed to maximize engagement.
And anger is engaging.
And the most efficient way to generate engagement is through outrage.
The algorithms learn what makes you angry and feed you a constant customized stream of it. They create impenetrable, personalized echo chambers.
So instead of a dictator forcing one reality on us via a state-run radio broadcast, the algorithms are fracturing reality into millions of personalized, highly emotional micro-realities. The source notes that modern digital authoritarianism thrives not on unified propaganda, but on this absolute shattering of a shared baseline.
If the public cannot even agree on basic, observable facts, who won a certified election, whether a global virus is real or a hoax, whether a riot at the Capitol is a violent insurrection or a peaceful protest, then democratic deliberation becomes literally impossible.
You can't even have the debate.
You cannot debate healthcare policy if you are living in different dimensions of reality.
And this leads to an environment where the strongman steps in, not necessarily by conquering the public, but because the public begs him to.
That's the most tragic part.
The text has a chilling takeaway regarding the timeline of this process. It emphasizes that destroying a republic is a slow, grinding erosion. It's not usually a sudden military coup in the dead of night.
The researchers argue that the most dangerous phase of democratic backsliding isn't the initial shock. It isn't the first broken norm or the first inflammatory speech.
What is the most dangerous phase?
Exhaustion.
Exhaustion.
When a society is bombarded with relentless chaos, constant institutional gridlock, daily manufactured digital outrage, and a shattered reality where nothing seems true anymore, the public simply becomes fatigued.
They just get tired.
The cognitive load of constantly defending democracy is too high. They get tired of fighting. They get tired of worrying about the collapse of the system.
And in that state of profound civic exhaustion, they don't fight the aspiring strongman.
They welcome him. They welcome authoritarian rule, not because they're evil, but because they view it as a rational, necessary return to basic quiet and order. They're willing to trade the complex, noisy liberty of a republic for the silent predictability of a dictatorship.
That is the true danger of the palingenetic continuum, as the source concludes. It doesn't rely on overpowering the democratic immune system. It relies on wearing it down until the body politic simply gives up.
It's a war of attrition.
So let's synthesize this warning as we look toward the end of our deep dive today. We have traced this blueprint from the palingenetic myths of national rebirth through the economic traumas of the middle class, the habituation to emergency decrees via Article 48, right down to the deliberate, calculated biological metaphors of dehumanization.
It's a lot to process.
It is. The researchers have laid out a compelling, structurally rigorous argument that the tectonic forces of the 1930s are undeniably active in our modern political landscape. The pathways to democratic decay are strikingly similar, even if the technology and the faces have changed.
The architecture of authoritarianism remains remarkably consistent. The vulnerability is always there.
But the text does provide a silver lining, a vital point of divergence from the history of Weimar Germany.
It does. A major reason Weimar Germany collapsed was that the political center, the moderate left, and the traditional conservatives refused to unite against the fascist threat until it was far too late.
They were too busy fighting each other.
They hated each other more than they feared the autocrats. But the researchers note that in modern democracies, explicitly including recent political cycles in the United States, we have actually seen the emergence of cross-ideological coalitions.
We're seeing people from the progressive left, the political center, and the traditional institutional right setting aside their intense policy differences
to defend the system itself.
They are uniting specifically to defend the structural blueprint of democratic institutions and the rule of law.
And that unity, that willingness to prioritize the survival of the democratic framework over short-term partisan victories, is historically the only effective mechanism for breaking the palingenetic continuum.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering, and frankly provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your weekend.
Yeah.
We know from the text that modern digital authoritarianism thrives on fracturing our shared reality into echo chambers of outrage.
Yeah, the algorithm problem.
And we know that defending the republic requires a unified, cross-ideological coalition of citizens acting together in the real world.
Right.
So the question we are left with is this: how do we unite to protect the republic when the very digital algorithms we use to communicate, organize, and understand the world are fundamentally designed to keep us violently apart?
That is the structural challenge of our generation.
It truly is. The J-Spot is a part of JBA Media, executive produced by Jay Rivera, edited by Dennis Ortiz and Gisette Garcia.